Hi, everyone. I see some folks starting to trickle in. We're going to start the webinar shortly. We'll just give folks a few minutes to get in, get their audio started, but welcome to the webinar. As people are joining, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and perhaps rename yourself with your name and your affiliation, if you'd like, so we can see who's attending. Great, we'll just give it one more minute as people continue to come in. All right, I think we can get started and others will join as we go. Again, if you've just joined, please feel free to introduce yourselves here in the chat and to edit your Zoom names to reflect your name and your organization if you'd like. Otherwise, welcome to our webinar, Protected and Conserved Areas Need People Building a Workforce to Manage 30% of the Planet. We're really happy to have you all here and are looking forward to the fruitful conversation ahead. Just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and we'll share the recording with everyone shortly after our session today. And as the webinar goes on, if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to use the Q&A box on your Zoom interface. You should be able to find it. So we can get started. I am really happy to welcome you to this webinar today dedicated to Protected and Conserved Areas staff in the light of the 30 by 30 ambitions. This webinar is jointly organized by the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, our Vital Site series, and the Universal Ranger Support Alliance, which you'll hear a little bit more about during the presentations. My name is Erin Drage. I'm the program officer for the World Commission on Protected Areas, and I have the pleasure of facilitating this discussion today. So I will start with just quickly walking you through the agenda for what our session holds for the next 90 minutes. So we'll start by introducing all of our speakers and then have them give their presentations. So a series of short talks from each of our speakers. We'll have about an hour for these presentations, and then we'll move into a 20 to 30 minute discussion where our panelists will answer questions posed by attendees. We'll probably take 2 or 3 questions from the audience that you'll be able to share using the Q&A feature. And then we will close the webinar at about 3:30 p.m. Central European Time. And just a quick note on ground rules, as the Vital Sites webinar series is a place of dialogue, we'd like to ask that everyone be respectful and understanding while sharing your views. So with that, let's get started. Just a quick introduction to what we're speaking about today. As you know, there's a global ambition for 30% of the planet to be protected and conserved by 2030. Over 100 countries have already committed to this goal by signing the High Ambition Coalition, which you may have already heard of. But despite the growing concern over planetary health, there are not nearly enough people working in protected and conserved areas right now. And in order to achieve our 30% by 2030 goal, we'll need to increase the number of protected and conserved areas employees and volunteers by about 5-fold. We'll hear more about how many people work in protected and conserved areas and how many more are needed throughout this webinar. But the numbers themselves are not the only challenge. We need to collectively ensure that protected and conserved areas are effectively managed. And to do so, we need capacity, people skills, we need diversity, we need different approaches to management, especially in Indigenous managed areas. So it's really an all hands on deck approach, not only because we're dangerously close to the climate breakdown, but also because we're all in it together. And the better we collaborate and coordinate, the better outcomes we will achieve. So I'm really looking forward to diving into this exciting webinar with you all today. And before we do so, I'll just run you through who our amazing speakers, our panelists are that we have on the line. So we'll be starting the webinar with Dr. Kathy Mackinnon, who's a special advisor to WCPA, the World Commission on Protected Areas, and is the former chair of IUCN WCPA. She currently co-chairs the WCPA Specialist Group on other effective area-based conservation measures, OECMs, and is a former lead biodiversity specialist for the World Bank. Kathy has had an incredibly rich career with over 40 years of experience working on conservation projects around the globe, including 10 years spent in Indonesia, where she engaged in tropical ecology research and protected areas planning and management. She is the author of over 100 scientific books and publications, including recent books that promote protected areas as proven, sustainable, natural solutions, helping societies to cope with climate change. In 2018, Kathy won the Midori Prize for Biodiversity, which, as many of you know, is a very prestigious conservation award and was well deserved. So Kathy will be our first speaker today. After Kathy, we'll hear from Mike Appleton. Mike is the Director of Protected Areas Management at Rewild and is also the Thematic Vice Chair for Capacity Development here at the IUCN WCPA. Mike focuses on applied area-based conservation in his work, building on scientific findings to achieve conservation results on the ground. This includes helping governments identify and establish protected areas, creating legal frameworks and systems of governance, developing management strategies and plans, and building the capacity of staff and organizations to meet the complex challenges of being guardians of the world's growing protected areas network. Very appropriate for our webinar topic today. He's the author of a very widely used IUCN guide to competences for protected area staff and is the leading author of the recently published article on protected areas personnel and ranger numbers that will be presented during today's webinar. Very exciting new paper that was just released. So that's Mike Appleton. After Mike, we'll hear from Rohit Singh, who is the chair of the Universal Ranger Support Alliance, URSA, who is the co-host for this webinar today. Rohit's current work advances wildlife conservation outcomes and helps reduce illegal and unsustainable wildlife exploitation and trade. Rohit also represents Asia in the International Ranger Federation, IRF, and works closely with ranger associations and conservation organizations to professionalize the ranger workforce. After Rohit, we will hear from Mikkel Rafa, who is the chair of our IUCN WCPA Specialist Group on privately protected areas and stewardship. Mikkel is also the director of Territory and Environment at the Foundation Catalunya La Pedrera, apologies, where he has worked since 1998. Mikkel is a biologist specialized in nature conservation with an experience of over 30 years working for conservation NGOs in Catalonia and at the international level. He's also the president of the Nature Conservation Council of Catalonia and has collaborated in numerous radio and TV programs as a communicator on nature and travels around the globe. After Mikkel, we will hear from Christina Skenga, who is a human rights promotion specialist. And Christina has worked in the human rights field since 1985 with the specific focus of promoting a better understanding and use of human rights standards to enhance the capacity of states to fulfill their obligations and promote the participation of industry and civil society in the protection and promotion of rights. So clearly very important work. Christina's worked for Amnesty International's Human Rights Education Worldwide program and is the co-founder of Human Rights Education Associates, a recognized provider of human rights e-courses to major human rights organizations such as the United Nations and Amnesty International. She also specializes in the design of learning programs for the development of human rights compliant law enforcement officials, such as police, migration services, nature conservation organizations like rangers in their work, and counterterrorism units. So Christina will bring us this human rights perspective, after which we will hear from Jim Barbarick, who is the Senior Advisor for the Center for Protected Areas Management at Colorado State University. Jim has worked for Conservation International as a specialist in protected areas for the Wildlife Conservation Society. His areas of interest include staff training, planning, management of protected areas, corridors and buffer zones, development of financial strategies, public use and institutional strengthening for parks and reserves, mitigation and adaptation to climate change, and conservation and management of wildlife. Now, unfortunately, Jim's unable to join us in person today, but he kindly shared a video that we will play shortly after Christina's talk, introducing the topic of volunteer rangers, and it's a really great video. And finally, our last speaker today will be Amy Malling, who is the ICC Regional Coordinator for Southeast Asia. Amy is a conservation and community development specialist, a forester by training, and a skillful project and landscape manager, equipped with all the technical tools, as well as the heart and courage to work in the interest of people, Indigenous communities, and conservation. She began working with WWF over 10 years ago in Cambodia and Myanmar, and continues working with them as a landscape conservation technical advisor. She's also volunteering with the Non-Timber Forest Product Exchange Program and as the regional coordinator for the ICCA Consortium in Southeast Asia. So that is our fantastic suite of panelists today, and we're very much looking forward to their insightful presentations. Again, I would like to thank everyone for being here. We're seeing a great list of attendees still trickling in, so I will happily pass it over to Dr. Kathy Mackinnon to get us started with a presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Erin, and good afternoon, everybody. I want to give you a very quick overview on other effective area-based conservation measures, OECMs, and the opportunities to engage some new partners in conservation. I'm sure you're all familiar with IHE Target 11, which set out targets for 2020 for effective and equitably managed systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. And that was the first time we heard this term, OECMs. Although the parties agreed at Nagoya to adopt that resolution, they didn't give a definition or criteria for OECMs. So in 2016, WCPA set up a task force to work on that issue. We had a lot of workshops, a lot of consultations with parties, and provided a lot of input to the agreed decision at COP14 in Egypt in 2018, where finally parties adopted the definition and criteria for OECMs. And in 2019, we put out our guidance document, the technical report on recognizing and reporting OECMs. And you can download that from the IUCN library. What is an OECM? It's a geographically defined area other than a protected area, governed and managed in ways that achieve positive long-term biodiversity outcomes. And it may also provide other services and values. The important thing is an OECM cannot be part of a protected area, and it must provide long-term biodiversity outcomes. So it's an important tool. As you know, in a few weeks at COP15, a new global biodiversity framework will be adopted with even more ambitious targets, even though we didn't quite realize IHE Target 11. As Erin has said, getting to the 30% target by 2030 will need new and expanded protected areas, but it will also need to strengthen the management and effectiveness of all protected areas. So a lot to be done capacity-wise, because we need quality as well as quantity. But a lot of big gains can also be made by recognizing, reporting, and supporting OECMs. There's a core difference between protected areas and OECMs. while a protected area must have a primary conservation objective, an OECM is defined by the fact that it delivers effective long-term biodiversity conservation, regardless of its management objectives. And both protected areas and OECMs can have all kinds of governance types. They can be governed and managed by government, private sector, Indigenous peoples and local communities, or by any shared combination. OECMs provide a real opportunity for more equitable conservation, an opportunity to recognize, engage and support a whole range of rights holders and partners in local to global conservation efforts. And they may be particularly relevant in helping to recognize the efforts of Indigenous peoples and local communities, as well as the private sector. But we need to remember, if we're working within the territories of Indigenous peoples and local communities, OECM should only be recognized with the free, prior and informed consent of those rights holders. So what might count as an OECM? Well, obviously areas that are important for biodiversity, but looking across the spectrum of opportunities, they may be Indigenous community conserved areas, locally managed marine areas, privately conserved areas that aren't recognized as protected areas under national legislation, permanent or long-term fisheries closure areas, which protect complete ecosystems, but are not just focused on single species. They could be freshwater and coastal wetlands, which are providing important ecosystem services, as well as biodiversity values. Or they may be natural ecosystems with low-level traditional use. Areas in production landscapes or seascapes that are intensively harvested and managed are unlikely to qualify as OECMs, although they may qualify if sustainably managed by contributing to sustainable use targets. But in all cases, sites need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. So what are we looking for? Areas with important biodiversity, areas that are not already regarded as protected areas, and areas where those who are responsible for governance and management are keen to recognize their areas as OECMs. We need to do a lot of work to increase understanding of OECMs and to build capacity to recognize and report them. WCPA has a whole suite of resources available, from the technical report, which gives overall guidance, to a shorter technical note which summarizes key points, training materials that provide an introduction, case studies of potential areas that may qualify as OECMs. And I particularly want to draw your attention to our simple, user-friendly site assessment tool. We'd love you to use it and to give us feedback on how we can improve it. And finally, we're preparing frequently asked questions and hoping to develop training modules for trainers. My 5 minutes is up, but I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Many thanks, Kathy, for that great introduction to OECMs. So as Mike queues up his screen for sharing, I'll just point out that those resources Kathy mentioned are in the chat box. So please do take a look, click those links and save them for later. They're very useful resources. And a reminder that you can drop your questions for any of our panelists in the question and answer feature here in Zoom. And with that, I will pass it over to Mike Appleton. Thank you.
Hi there, I hope everyone can see the screen fine. Hi, I'm going to report on our recent study on protected area personnel numbers and just discuss a few of the implications of that study. The paper was just published in Nature Sustainability and is, I'm sure someone will put the link in the chat, and is the first global study of protected area personnel numbers since 1999 and the first ever of global ranger numbers. It includes data from 176 countries and territories, and lots of clever statistics. I'm not going to go into the details. I'm going to jump straight to the results. You can read the paper in your own time. It is open access, so free to all. Here's what we came up with. We estimate that the moment in terrestrial areas, there are 555,000 people working at most, and 285,000 of those are rangers. Based on various publications and analyses, we think that's about 1/3 of the number which are actually needed for effective management. So we've got a real staffing shortfall. And if we're looking at more or less doubling the area under effective management by 2030, then we need to double the number again. So we need a lot more people, 1.25 million rangers, for example. If we look at densities of personnel, at the moment, it's for rangers, it's about 1 per 72 square kilometers. Actually, that number has not changed since 1999. We've got more people, but more protected areas, but the density hasn't changed. Based on a range of publications and analysis, we think that figure should, on average, be 1 per 26 square kilometers on average. So again, a real shortfall. The number may seem quite high, 1.5 million. If you think that there are more than 12 million, up to 28 million people globally employed in forestry, which is also about 35% of the world, the number is tiny. And we looked up some rather strange statistics. More people working US golf courses and country clubs and in the UK hair and beauty industry than there are rangers in the whole world. And there are also 20 million private security guards in the world, more than 80 times more than there are rangers, which shows the comparison between our value of private property and the resources and places which keep us all alive. So the number is in fact tiny. Why is it good to know the numbers? Well, most sectors, health, medicine, education, monitor the workforce. Workforce information can help us set norms for adequate staffing, promote investment in people, help plan recruitment over the long term in a strategic way, help plan and get economies of scale for support such as training, and contribute to effectiveness monitoring. Numbers can also help us start to look at some economics. Our paper did some very simple economics. There's much more that needs to be done. We think that each new protected area worker can add at least $28,800 in gross value of production per worker per year, which is on a par with agriculture and forestry on the basis of the ecosystem services which they are protecting. In other words, investing in protected area workers can be shown to make financial sense too. Therein said at the start, numbers are not enough. We know from a range of publications that protected area personnel in many countries are underpaid, undersupported, have poor working conditions, and work under outdated and unsuitable systems of governance. And if you combine these factors with the chronically low numbers, this really undermines effectiveness and also increases the likelihood of mistakes in management, of casualties and abusive behaviors. So we have to deal with these issues. Also, we need to think a little bit about the composition of the future workforce. It's not going to be just more rangers like we know them now. At the moment, about 3/4 of the world's protected areas are state managed with fairly conventional park staff. But when we get to 30 by 30, the likelihood is that much of the increase will be in non-state owned and managed sites. Much of it will be in OECMs. The owners and stewards will be far more diverse: NGOs, local communities, indigenous peoples, private owners, and so on. So the overall, although the numbers need to increase, we also have to start thinking about the composition of the workforce and their needs. And this is also why we need to start thinking ahead about this now. So we're going to start, if you like, having to redefine rangers and protected area staff for their work and their work. The kind of tasks that need to be done will always be required in different contexts, but they're going to be conducted by a much more diverse set of people, state and non-state people, and they may be conducted using different approaches to governance and stewardship, especially in indigenous areas. So we need more people we need better quality management, and we need to think about about an evolving, very different workforce. That's a very brief summary of our findings. I urge you to read the paper to get more details. We'll welcome any questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike, for that wonderful presentation. And if you have not already seen this paper in Nature Sustainability, I really do recommend you check it out. The link is in the box. Next, we'll have Rohit Singh present from URSA. Mike, if you can stop sharing your screen for us, and Rohit can go ahead and share, get going with the next presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot. In next 5 to 10 minutes, I'm going to quickly talk about why we started URSA and what's the purpose behind it. So many of us on this call have been either we are rangers or we have been supporting rangers. But what has been missing in the ranger community, that ranger work has been seen, especially by the NGO community, as a welfare project, where you need a pair of boots, rangers need a pair of boots, give them trainings, and that will solve the problem. Rangers have not been seen as a workforce that need reforms, that needs professionalization. So this journey of URSA started in 2019 at the 9th World Ranger Congress, which was hosted in Nepal in Chitwan National Park. This Congress was unique in many ways. It was the largest ever Congress conducted in the history of International Ranger Federation. We had 550 rangers from 70 countries. It was largest ever Congress, but it had a 45% women representation. It has 21% IPLC representation. It had rangers, but at the same time, it also had ex-prime minister inaugurating the Congress. So it was a very unique Congress in its own way. Every Congress comes up with a declaration, but as it happens in many meetings that we sign declarations, and there is a lack of follow-up, if I could say. But this Congress was very different because International Ranger Federation wanted to make sure that we have a follow-up actions to it. So the declaration, which was called Chitwan Declaration, clearly asked the conservation community to come together and develop an action plan to address the needs that have been identified in the Chitwan Declaration that was signed by 550 rangers. So that gave us the starting point for conservation NGOs to come together. And the logos you see, these organizations came together. And in July 2020, a 5-year MOU was signed among them to develop an action plan to implement the Chitwan Declaration. The purpose of the Alliance, Universal Ranger Support Alliance, is to help implement the Chitwan Declaration, to address the issues rangers are facing, some of the issues that Mike mentioned, not poor welfare conditions, to not having adequate numbers. But we are also very clear as Universal Ranger Support Alliance, we are not rangers. And we do not represent rangers. We are here to support rangers. So we are very clear that our role is to strengthen International Ranger Federation, which is a legitimate ranger body, so that they can advocate for the rights of rangers, and maybe URSA should not exist in next few years. So first step was the Chitwan Declaration had 8 thematic areas where the actions or the gaps were identified, or there were clear needs identified by the rangers. What URSA did, we hired experts from all over the world that ran these experts, started the global consultation process, and 8 white papers were put together on these subject areas that looked into the challenges rangers are facing, what can be done to address those challenges globally, regionally, and nationally. These white papers made the basis of the URSA action plan. So the vision of there is a 5-year action plan, and our vision is to see motivated, responsible, representative, and an accountable ranger workforce, because we strongly believe nobody is going to invest in a workforce that is not accountable. So we have to have an accountable ranger workforce. URSA provides a global unified voice for rangers. It's very unique. There has never been any alliance that talk about the rights of rangers and the challenges of rangers and professionalization of rangers. It will set capacity and employment standards, ensure the ranger workforce has right conduct and accountability. The action plan is designed around these 5 thematic areas. And these thematic areas range from advocacies to equity, equality, to welfare, and to accountability. We started with smaller group of people, but now, as you can see, the Alliance network is growing. We have more and more national and regional organizations joining us. Now, I will very briefly walk you through on some of the initiatives that we have taken in past 2 years since URSA started. As I said in the beginning, our role is to support International Ranger Federation. So we have been helping International Ranger Federation to assess the role of ranger associations nationally, what role ranger associations can play, and how we can strengthen ranger associations to advocate for the rights of rangers. The paper that Mike has published, that was the first step, because you can't reform the workforce if you don't know how many people are there in the workforce. So that was the very first crucial step. Then there is a sort of a misconception that rangers means only uniformed people. There is a large amount of rangers who come from the informal sector. There are many more people, probably 5 times higher than what the formal sector has, that they play ranger equivalent role. So trying to understand their role, how do they interact with rangers? Actually, one of our survey also shows that 36% rangers come within 20 kilometers of the park they are posted. So many rangers are also IPLCs. We have released the first ever gender report on rangers. And in terms of the policy, as I said, that our objective is to make sure that there are more rangers, better equipped, better trained rangers, but at the same time, accountable rangers. And that's where the Ranger Code of Conduct comes in. It is the first ever global code of conduct for rangers. It is available in 13 languages. We have been doing trainings, webinars across the globe. In past 3 months, we have trained 671 rangers from 61 countries on the code of conduct. We are working with International Labour Organization on developing welfare standards for rangers. You all will be surprised to know that International Labour Organization does not even recognize rangers as an occupation. That makes it really difficult to fight for the labor rights. Even the UN occupation list sort of put rangers under arts and entertainment along with circus workers. So it's really hard to advocate for the rights for rangers. And finally, we have been, and this event is contributing to the same objective, is working towards reforming the ranger narrative. Rangers do not play only law enforcement role. Rangers have a lot more roles, much bigger role to play, right from educators to first responders to researchers to people who prevent zoonotic disease. Rangers are not only uniformed people, rangers are volunteers, rangers are indigenous people, rangers are local communities. So we are conducting a lot of awareness throughout the globe to talk about the wider role rangers play so that we can explain how do rangers fit into the bigger conversations that are happening globally. So this is, in a nutshell, what we have been trying to do as URSA. You can find a lot of these material which I mentioned on the website. It's available in multiple languages, which is one of our objectives, to make all these materials accessible to rangers. For any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rohit, for the wonderful presentation and the great overview of some of URSA's work. Just a reminder for everyone, URSA is a co-host for this webinar today. And as Rohit mentioned, they have a plethora of resources available on their website. So please do go and take a look if you're not familiar already. Next up, we will have Mikel Rafa do a short presentation for us that will complement what we've been hearing so far. So Mikel, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to present now what we are doing at the specialist group of IUCN on privately protected areas and nature stewardship, which is essentially is to recognize, to better understand. This is quite a new process in many countries, and to raise the quality and the integrity of this private conservation done worldwide. This is something that, first of all, needs to be usually to insist that a privately protected area is a protected area as defined by IUCN, and it goes under the private governance. And this can be very, very different. But usually we talk about individuals or families who are owners of the land. There are many privately protected areas which are managed by non-governmental organizations or foundations. But sometimes there are also corporations and companies who are managing these areas, both for profit or for not-profit interest. And sometimes there is also some smaller areas which are managed by research entities like universities. Usually some of the field stations they have can be considered privately protected areas as well. And sometimes even the religious entities, the religions, sometimes in many countries are owners of many lands and many places where usually there are some areas dedicated to the church, and these are sometimes very important places to maintain and to preserve. This is clearly now within the Convention of Biodiversity as well, recognized as one of the growing areas of work. And this is something that, especially to fulfill the objectives of the 30 by 30 conservation, we need to include. We have been delivering guidelines for this in the website of IUCN. You can find we have now different languages: English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and also Polish and Japanese. So there are many options for you. One of the questions that we are now, our priority is to recognize these areas in the world database of protected areas, because usually it's under recognized, and not so many countries in the world has already submit their privately protected areas. So this is still very few of them. You can see in this map the blue areas, the blue dots, are the privately protected areas. So there are many areas in the world where there is no one, no even a single kind. So this is something that we are working on, and we insist that this should be internationally recognized. Otherwise, in many cases, they are not existing. Another point is what refers to land stewardship or even marine stewardship. Usually is something that many organizations and the private sector is doing, trying to develop programs to protect some areas which are not privately protected areas. They are not recognized as a private, as a protected area, And in this case, usually the land stewardship programs usually lies more on the OECMs category that has already been explained. And this is a gray area sometimes, so we develop technical notes and some other information. So in order to define more precisely which is a privately protected area and which is not, and lies on the OECM category. And last but not least, these are some of the links that you can use to have more information on this. Our mantra is that this concept is that the private means put all the resources, but there is a public benefit in all this work. So the benefit is really shared with the other traditional public protected areas, and the benefits are for the whole community. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mikel. That's fantastic. When we're talking about the workforce in protected areas, it's so important to consider all of these different kinds of protected areas and OECMs. So really appreciate that. Next up, we're going to hear from Jim Barbarick, who, as I mentioned, is not here with us live today, but we do have a great video presentation queued up. So we'll get that up on the screen to hear a little bit about the volunteer workforce in protected areas around the world. Olga, are you able to share your screen with Jim's video? Perfect.
Hello. I've been asked to speak briefly today about the important role of volunteers in meeting protected area personnel needs. If we are going to successfully go from just over 500,000 protected area workers to over 3 million to meet our 2030 goal of 30% of the world's surface protected on land and in our oceans, then we're going to have to use a variety of different personnel options to meet those needs. A very large percentage of the new personnel working in protected areas around the world are not necessarily going to be full-time government employees. Rather, successful park agencies, both government ones and those, for example, of NGOs and communities around the world, are increasingly relying on an array of different approaches to meet their personnel needs. Most protected areas have seasonality in tourism and seasonality in the types of threats they face and programs and maintenance tasks they have. Fires don't usually go on year-round in protected areas. Tourism usually has its peaks and ebbs. And so for many of the tasks involved in protected area management done by rangers, for example, seasonal employees can help augment the full-time and part-time staff. In addition, many protected areas take advantage of the fact that in many countries, to get a degree as a conservationist, you need to do an internship as part of your graduation requirements. And so continuing to rely on interns is going to be something very important for many, many agencies. Another key way of meeting needs is interagency loans, for example, where police forces or the defense ministry or the health ministry or public works ministry helps augment protected area staff. In addition, obviously, academia plays a huge role in helping meet personnel needs for protected areas, both through the research projects done by professors and students, but also through their own internship programs, through volunteer and outreach activities, and other ways that universities can provide support to protected areas, both around the corner and around the world. Increasingly, with a focus on other effective conservation measures and on the role of communities, indigenous peoples, we know that communities themselves are going to play a much bigger role in the workforce. Some of these are going to be paid positions, but very often they're going to be community fire brigades or community trail brigades or other types of community support mechanisms that rely on volunteers from communities. And finally, around the world, there's increasing emphasis on public-private partnerships, particularly with for-profit tourism enterprises, for example, where they manage much of the public use programs and protect areas through concessions, contracts, and other mechanisms. But I want to focus in the rest of the talk on something I consider to be very important. Today, I put on my U.S. National Park Service volunteer hat to talk about the role of volunteers in protected area management. I want to give you an example from the U.S. National Park Service. I live just an hour from one of the most visited national parks in the United States, Rocky Mountain, which gets 4.5 million visitors a year. We're going to talk more about it in a moment. But the entire Park Service, for managing a little over 400 units, has only 15,000 staff that are full-time and another 10,000 seasonals. But on top of that, they have thousands of staff paid by concessionaires to run tourism services in parks, campgrounds, visitor centers. There are over 5,000 employees of just one concessionaire company in Yellowstone National Park alone, a park that has under 1,000 employees. But here's where I want to really focus, that the Park Service says it had 279,000 volunteers in 2019. So you can see that that's an order of magnitude more than its combined full-time and seasonal workforce. And I want to talk very specifically about the park nearest to me, Rocky Mountain, which, as mentioned, has 4.5 million visitors a year. It's about 100,000 hectares. It only has 179 permanent staff, 249 seasonal staff. But here's what I want to focus on. That park gets 2,200 volunteers. They develop over 100,000 hours of free work for the system, for the park each year. And that's quantified as being worth over $3 million on top of the park regular budget, which is around, I think from all sources, about 20 million. And this is the equivalent of over 50 full-time equivalents, FTEs, to the park staff. And volunteers at this park work in all aspects of park management except law enforcement. They work in environmental education, interpretation, research, resource management, and they work on maintenance. Many of them work on trails, for example. So they play a wide variety of roles. I want to end by talking about my experience in working in over 30 countries, of lessons about parks and protected area agencies that are doing a good job with using volunteers to the max. The first is to create a culture of volunteering in the country and in conservation organizations where they regularly have programs to attract, recruit, train, and retain good volunteers. Another thing is that volunteer programs that are most successful don't only focus on the young. It's extremely important to use all classes of society, people from all walks of life, and people of all ages, including a greater focus on the growing number of gray warriors, of retirees, people in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s willing to volunteer. Another thing is that volunteer programs require having good policies regarding benefits for volunteers, their rights and responsibilities, what happens in case of an accident or an injury. And so good laws, policies, and regulations required for good volunteer programs to work. Next, it's very important to see younger volunteers as the workforce of the future and use the volunteer programs to help recruit the next generation of protected area managers around the world, particularly in countries where my own, where a very high percentage of all protected area staff across all local, state, and federal agencies are eligible for retirement or will be within the next 10 years. The next thing is that volunteer programs require ensuring the rights of volunteers, creating incentives such as providing them with uniforms, providing them with training. In some cases, like my country, providing tax breaks to individuals for the mileage from the use of personal vehicles to serve as volunteers. It's very important to make sure the volunteer programs are not just focused on foreigners or individuals from elite sectors of society and from far away. It's very important to try to create local brigades, local volunteer programs that in some countries like Costa Rica, the international volunteer programs actually subsidize the creation of national volunteer programs. That's a great example. And then finally, it's important to mention that volunteers can play almost any role that paid staff can play with adequate training, equipment, and supervision. Thank you very much. I hope that all of you think about how we can use a whole range of types of personnel, including volunteers, to help us meet that huge gap of going from about 500,000 people working in protected areas around the world to the 3 million that recent studies indicate that we need in a very short period of time. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that great presentation from Jim, who could not be here, but is clearly has put his mind to the task of expanding the workforce necessary for protected areas. So really interesting to hear the volunteer side. Next up, we'll be hearing from Christina Skanga on a very different component of the workforce necessary for protected areas. So Christina, we welcome you to share your screen and look forward to your short presentation.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm just briefly going to touch on equality and equity and why they matter to human rights, but also why they matter to conservation, the topic we've been dealing with in this webinar. So equality and equity in human rights mean that human rights require equality to be the end goal. When we're talking about human rights, we're talking about bringing protection, equal protection of human rights to everyone. And this is to protect the dignity of individuals, regardless of their origin, etc. While we mean that equity is the means to get there. So equality is the end result that we want, while equity is going to help us achieve this end result, which is going to mean respect of human rights for everyone. So let's explore what we mean by equality. Equality is the provision to everyone of the same number of resources, of opportunities, regardless of where they need them or not. So the concept of equality is saying we're all equal, and we have all equal value. In other words, each person receives an equal share of resources or opportunities despite of what they already have or don't have. And if you think about this, you might start asking, but if Christina has so much, what should we give her more while Jane has less? Well, that's a very reasonable question, and that's why we have equity as a key component of the realization of equality. And because equity is when resources or opportunities are shared based on what each person needs. So the person who needs the most will get the most. So it is giving more to those who need it, which is proportionate to their own circumstances and needs, in order to ensure that everyone has the same chances to fulfill their potential. And these concepts are very much enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as being essential. So here is a pictorial demonstration of equality and equity. We can say we're all equal, but no, if somebody is shorter, is not going to be able to reach the apple. And if we don't give them some support, if we don't apply equity and provide them with an extra crate so that they can reach the branch and also be able to have an apple or have access to justice, if it's somebody with disabilities, then we need to build the ramp so that they have access to the court. So equity is an essential aspect. So when we're talking about equality and equity indirectly in 30 by 30, we're talking about the need, the importance to manage projects of whichever nature and all the people involved applying the concept of equality and applying human rights. This means that we're going to look at how we apply equality when we are talking about the rule of law, or when we're talking about before the law. So are we providing in these areas equal access to protection of the law to those individuals involved? Are we applying due process in developing the projects and looking at how they are run and managed? Fair trial, are we assessing and evaluating, and our assessments and evaluations are based in concepts of equality and are taking into account equity? Non-discrimination. Discrimination is the foundation of human rights violations, as it is corruption. So here we need to look at what are we doing to combat discrimination, and what actions are we taking to make sure that equality is making a reality? What support are we giving for those people who have been made vulnerable and do not have access to equal and equitable treatment? So when we're talking about equality, we're talking about equality of outcome. There should be fair outcomes in when we're developing our projects. Equality of autonomy. Do those people involved in the conservation projects, and do they have autonomy? Do they have agency? Does everybody has comparable agency to express themselves, to receive the information they need, to be able to fully make decisions and participate in these projects, conservation projects or other activities? Equality of opportunity. Are we giving a chance to everyone who is interested and who could benefit from this protection of biodiversity? So in a way, what we're saying is that equality embedded in equity should be an essential part of the management of any enterprise, is part of good governance, which is something that we need to seek in terms as we develop 30 by 30. And in that sense, the recommendation is that any program, project, or initiative, private, public, or mixed, should have established criteria to evaluate the compliance with equality. And there should be continuous evaluation of the respect and development of equality for all. We're not talking about gender equality, we're talking about equality in all aspects of access, depending on cultural background, equality against racism, equality to protect the rights of indigenous and local communities. So equality is a very wide spectrum of protecting the rights of everyone, because we all have the same intrinsic value as human beings and the right to have dignity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina, for that fantastic and succinct overview of what is a very complex topic. Much appreciated and very important in this context. So we have just one speaker left who's going to provide a short presentation before we move into our panel discussion. So we'll be hearing from Amy Malling next. And as she is queuing up and getting ready, I will just remind you that the question and answer function is enabled here in Zoom, and we will happily pull a few questions from the audience during our upcoming panel discussion. So please feel free to drop those into the question and answer space. And with that, I will pass it over to Amy.
Okay, yeah, so good day, everyone. So I'll be talking about the indigenous people's territories and local communities, locally community conserved areas, or ICCA, or sometimes we call them as territories of life. Yeah, so maybe just to give a brief introduction about the My slide is okay. About the ICCA Global Consortium. So we are a group of, members or organizations. We are present in 80 countries globally, and now we have more than 200 membership organizations and around 400 individual members. We call them as honorary members. And we also have regional networks. So the one I'm coordinating is the Southeast Asia Regional Networks. And we work with working groups at the national level. We call them the ICCA working groups or OECM working groups in different parts of or different countries. Yeah. So what are the ICCAs? Because we're talking a lot about OECM now. So maybe just to give a brief overview of what ICCAs are. So we call them the territories of life. We refer them also to the term territories of life, but they come in different names actually at the local level. It's not a new concept. It's an old concept, and indigenous peoples and local communities are already doing conservation in their territories. And in the definition that IUCN developed together with some members organizations of the ICCA Global Consortium, they identified 3 important characteristics of ICCAs. First is that there should be an existing relationship, a deep relationship between the local communities, indigenous peoples, to their territories. And that there should be a functional, traditional, or probably non-traditional also, a governance structure that could be formally or not formally recognized by the government, and that the result of that relationship and effective governance is contributing to positively to biodiversity conservation. So these are important, elements of an ICCA. And here I'd like to, because we're talking of human resources in protected areas and conserved areas, and the first speakers have been talking also on the importance of engaging local communities in conservation. So here, just to share with you some examples of traditional governance system. Here I'm presenting here one of the ICCAs in the Philippines. So in the Philippines, ancestral domains are communally owned. So they are issued land title by the virtue of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Acts of the Philippines. So here, one example is that here in the Pangasanan Sacred Mountains of the Manobo tribe in the Philippines. So their ancestral domains is divided into 9 sectors and being managed by Council of Leaders. And then the Council of Leaders are the ones who are discussing the high level issues affecting their territories. But the sector leaders are the ones doing conflict resolutions and security of their ancestral territories. Then there are also you are terming them informal rangers, but actually they have their own local names also on how they're organizing themselves in their roles in their ancestral domain. So here in the Manobo tribe, they call them the Bagani or the warriors. So these are the members of the communities who are involved in enforcing policies in their territories and apprehension of illegal activities and also illegal migrant or entry of people or migrants in their ancestral domains. So the Council of Leaders and some spirit leaders are the one advising them. So this is the traditional governance and not necessarily recognized by the government, but for them to be able to secure their communal land title, they also have to set up their formal or legal governance. So here in the Manobo tribe, they named their group group as the Manubo Tribal Council. And so this is the legal entity that they use when they're dealing with the government or also because they also get funding, from non-government organizations or other donors, and for them also to secure their land title, or if they want to set up also some community enterprises, so they're using the legal structure. So this is one example of an ICCA that has still traditional governance. But in the Salween Peace Park, where I work in Myanmar, this is a situation where the ancestral or the traditional governance has been lost because of the, some civil unrest or political situation in the country, so they lost their traditional governance. But when they set up their Salween Peace Park or their Peace Park, so they have to organize a new version of their governance. So here it's not only composed of the indigenous communities, but they also include, it's more of a multi-layered governance system, which also includes the civil societies or organizations that are present or working in the Peace Park. And of course, the Karen National Union, a non-state, administrative body belonging to the Karen indigenous peoples, and also the representatives from the different village around there, the Peace Park, but these community representatives were elected by the village level. So then a chairperson is elected to manage the governance structure. So there are many examples, but given the short time, I only presented these two examples. Yeah, and there is in Target 11, actually the ICCA consortium was organized as a social movement as a result of promoting the recognition of indigenous peoples and local communities' contribution to conservation. So the members of the consortium have been involved in putting that language in the Target 11. And so the OECM word has been there in Target 11 since 2020. But I think the discussion about OECM is just happening in the last 3 years, probably. Here in Southeast Asia, we just started talking about OECM only in 2018, but it has been there since 2020. And the movement on ICC have already started since 2008. And in the Philippines, there are already, several numbers of ICCAs that are registered in the Protected Area database and also in the Global ICCA registry. But here, just to highlight the difference between the ICCA and OECM, yes, ICCA could be one of the models of OECM, but just to differentiate that ICCAs are areas that are managed or conserved by indigenous peoples and local communities. While the OECM, on the other hand, is probably broader, or they could be more different, forms of governance. It could be individual or private companies that are managing OECM. Not other than, of course, the indigenous peoples, just to highlight that. And here in Southeast Asia, in partnership with the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, the Non-Timber Forest Exchange Program and the ICCA Consortium did a study on identifying the different governance mechanisms and a legal framework for recognizing OECMs. And here we came up with 4 different models of OECM. So the one on the left sides are more managed by combination of government or private sector. So these are examples of the conservation areas or conservation agreements. that are established for, or as mandated by policy and or other purposes. And then there are also the models on areas for ecosystem services like carbon trading or income generation, for example, tourism activities. So here in the Philippines, for example, we have an example of one island that was bought by a private a non-government organization, mostly for protect or for ecotourism activities, but it's also having, contribution to biodiversity. And then we have the models of social forestry. So in Southeast Asia, there's the community forestry or community-based forest management. So these are areas of, issued for an agreement between the government and the community, more for sustainable forest management or livelihood activities. So in Cambodia, they have the community protected areas or community forest. And in the Philippines, we have the community-based forest management. And then the last model is where the ICCA belongs. These are the areas that are then under customary tenure, and where the indigenous peoples have traditional claims to the areas. And this is where in the last model, this is where the ICCA is can be categorized. So we look at this the different instrument under the customary tenure in different countries, and assess them also according to the criteria that are identified by IUCN in their technical guidelines on what are the ICCM. So like first, it should not be a protected area, and that it is grounded geographically delineated, and then that it has a sustained governance. And in that area, there should be a biodiversity value, important key species, or a unique features, an important ecosystem service, or important habitats. And then there's also the criteria on it having effective and long-term in situ conservation. So so the one in the customary forest in Indonesia, so there is also a probability of these areas being included as OECM. In Myanmar, they have the protected area law, the new modified protected area law also included community conserved areas, and that could also be considered as OECM. And the revised forestry law in Vietnam, and in the Philippines, we have the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. So these are mostly, there are areas that overlap with protected areas, but many areas that are also not designated as protected areas in the Philippines. And there are traditional existing governance systems. Most of the ancestral domains in the Philippines have biodiversity values, and well, they have been doing conservation for a longer time. And in Cambodia, an example also is that the communal land title. But I think in Cambodia, not all communal land title would have biodiversity values or have effective and long-term conservation, because some of these also are in the production forest or agricultural areas. And yeah, so I guess for us in the ICCA consortium, still in the upcoming 15, these are still the messages that the consortium wants to communicate in the COP15, so that we continue to advocate for the recognition of customary ownership of indigenous peoples and their role in custodians of biological diversity. to support the indigenous people in their existing conservation efforts. So recognize that in these areas, there are already ongoing conservation efforts. So if the communities are not happy to be designated as protected areas, then we should recognize what they're already doing. There are still a lot of issues on violation of human rights, especially or threats to ancestral domains, especially from development projects like hydropower or other infrastructure activities, extractive industries in the area. So the indigenous peoples still need support from organizations like us in terms of defending their territories, and that in conservation initiative, that there are also safeguards to prevent human rights violations. And with that, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy, for that insightful presentation. I think that really ties together a lot of the themes that we've been talking about throughout this webinar. And that was our final presentation. Amy, I can have you stop sharing your screen. Great, thank you. So we do have a few minutes for a short panel discussion and some question and answers from the audience as well. So now's a great time to reflect back on all of the fantastic presentations we've just had over the last hour and consider what you might like to ask these wonderful experts that we have here with us. We would happily take your questions in the question and answer option at the bottom of your Zoom bar. You can, right next to the raise hand icon, there's an opportunity to type your question into the question and answer box, or you can type it directly into the chat. So to start with a question for our panelists, I think, Mike, I will direct this one to you. I'm wondering, from the perspective of the specific groups that we've discussed today throughout these presentations, what do you think is the priority action that needs to be taken to address the very urgent needs that we're seeing within the workforce for protected and conserved areas?
How long have you got? Specifically, in the discussions of the COP15 coming up, a lot of people are going to be talking about money and resources. And I want people to be talking about what those money and resources are spent on. In the end, conservation in the field is delivered by people. And as we've noted, a huge diversity of people. And resources need to be channeled towards helping those people achieve the level of capacity and working conditions and recognition that they need. So that's a kind of a major issue. In the kind of state sector, going back to the work which URSA is doing and what Rohit was talking about, this whole drive towards professionalization. I see we have a question about professional recognition of protected area staff, which doesn't even exist in many countries. They need to be recognized as real workers doing important jobs. And following on from Amy's talk, we need some, we don't have the right term yet. I've been using the term ranger equivalent, but what Amy showed us was basically a management and governance structure which is entirely analogous to what is set up in a conventional protected area. It's just done through a different way of governance and stewardship. And those people need to be given the same level of recognition. And we must remember that what they do doesn't come for free. They also need to be afforded the level of resources to be able to do what we're asking them to do. That's a brief answer.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to hear that insight. And you mentioned at the beginning of your response about COP15 and the likelihood of upcoming conversations around funding and resources. And I wonder, Kathy, Dr. Kathy Mackinnon, maybe if you could take a stab at answering for us in both the context of the biodiversity COP15 coming up in just a few weeks and the climate change COP27 that just took place earlier this month in Egypt. I wonder how you see these two global fora contributing to this conversation around the workforce and our 30 by 30 ambitions.
Thanks, Erin. Well, of course, COP27 has a strong emphasis on nature-based solutions, of which protected and conserved areas are part, and a strong emphasis on really checking deforestation. And there will be new resources committed to that, as we saw from the G20 announcements from Bali. At COP15, we're expecting everybody to agree these much more ambitious targets. And I'm sure there'll be some very difficult discussions on financing for that. But sustainable funding, you know, is a challenge for protected areas right across the board. So what we tend to get with projects is feasts and then famine. So I think everybody is looking at how we can stretch the resources to be the most effective that they can. We do have good examples from Latin America, very successful examples of trust funds that are providing sustainable financing for state-run protected areas. I think as far as OECMs go, the real challenge is understanding why those areas are effective at the moment and what support to those who are governing and managing those areas, what support do they need? If it's state land that's, say, a military training area, probably none in terms of finance, just recognition. If it's an area managed by local communities, what support do they need? Do they need better acknowledgement of their land and use rights, as Amy was talking about? Do they need financial resources and training, payments for ecosystem services? I mean, this is a hugely complex and varied topic. I would love to be very optimistic and say we're going to see an awful lot of more resources coming for biodiversity conservation and filtering down to the workforce. But I think that NGOs and other organizations are still going to have a challenging time going forward. Because we do have this wide diversity of actors and a wide diversity of needs and rather limited resources to help support them. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathy. I really appreciate your insights on that. And I think it's very timely since we are in between these two very large and potentially important meetings, depending on the outcomes. So thanks for your thoughts. I wonder if, Mikkel, if you have anything to add to this question around COP27, COP15, these global fora, and where this topic of the workforce for 30 by 30 plays into those two forms.
Yeah, I think that the question is that as Mike was stressing, we should make sure that there is enough people to deliver the work on the ground. So at the end, this is what is most important. Usually these conferences are also generalistic, and they are trying to focus on the big pictures and the big numbers and the main concepts. But usually it's difficult to get into these, let's say, ground level discussions. So I'm afraid that, for instance, I haven't seen much outputs coming from the COP27 dealing with the precise work or the actions that should be delivered by rangers or the staff people or the capacity of the organizations that had to deliver this work. And I think that, for instance, in our specific areas, which are coming from the private sector, and especially from NGOs and the civic and social organizations, the volunteer work is essential to fulfill all this work. And I'm not saying that this should be done only with volunteers, which is, of course, it's not the case. But even in this case, if you take the volunteer work, it should be also recognized, and should be also rules and recognition of this kind of work in order to make the things properly. And for instance, in some countries like my country, there is a specific legislation that you have to compile if you are using volunteer staff or volunteer work, and should be very clear which are the rights and the rules that you should compile in order to use properly this kind of people that wants to do something positive for their environment, and using their time and providing their time to build on this conservation work. This I think is one of the questions that we have to address, but I'm afraid that the big conferences are usually so large and so focused on the big questions, and usually these other questions, which are more practical, more on the ground level, are usually overlooked.
Thanks for the very honest answer, Mikel. And I think luckily we saw some really great examples of the practical solutions on the ground presented from all of you today. So I appreciate that. I think we have time for just one last question before we wrap up the webinar. I see we had a question from the audience. And Amy, I think I'll direct this one to you. The question was, what payment system do you think would be adequate for local communities co-managing state or NGO managed protected areas? So Amy, yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, so I cannot talk of one form of payment, but maybe just to share some of the examples, at least in communities that I know in terms of payment for ecosystems. So in one ancestral waters here in the Philippines, it's a beautiful island. It's managed by the indigenous communities 100%. So they're the ones earning the income from tourism activities. So it became a will of a community actually already from tourism activities. So they're using some of those, of course, for social services, but they're also using for their patrolling activities around their ancestral waters. The ICCA that I just shared from the Manobo tribe in the Philippines, it's a very important watershed of 4 provinces in the country, and they're getting payment from the water authorities here in the Philippines. One community managed to market their carbon stock to voluntary markets, and I think also when we say recognize them as OECM, I think the national government should also think of how they can provide budgets to recognize OECMs, like they're budgeting for protected areas. Here in the Philippines, we have a proposed law on ICCA bill. So we're hoping if that ICCA bill is passed, then the government should also be allocating budget for the indigenous peoples and local communities in managing their ICCA. So I think it's a principle of sharing the benefits of these areas, but also sharing the cost of doing the work on the ground, shared by the communities and the government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. I think your response really shows the amount of creativity that will be necessary for funding the workforce that is necessary to reach 30 by 30. I appreciate your insight. Thank you for that. With that, we will wrap up the webinar. I would just like to extend a very heartfelt thank you to all of you in the audience for attending this webinar, and certainly to the speakers presenting and sharing all of these insights with us. And of course, to the background staff who make these Vital Sites webinars possible. We really do appreciate it. And so this webinar has been recorded, and we will be happy to share the video recording within the next few weeks to attendees, and it will be available online. And we'd also like to take a quick second to remind you about a second webinar that we're having tomorrow, starting at 1:30 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, and that webinar will be discussing how to build trust between rangers and local communities. So it's a really nice complementary webinar, a good follow-up to what we just discussed today. So thank you so much to everyone. We're putting a few final links in the chat for you to take a look at, and we encourage you to come join us tomorrow for our second webinar on the topic of rangers. So thank you, everyone, and hope you have a great rest of your day, wherever you are in the world. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks.